Hi, my name is Lizzie Chan, and I'm a member of the CPR Institute's Young Leaders in Alternative Dispute Resolution Steering Committee. I am delighted to host today's episode of the CPR Y-ADR Corporate Counsel Interview Series. The Y-ADR seeks to educate the next generation of leaders on the full spectrum of dispute resolution and prevention mechanisms, and to provide an insider's perspective into how CPR's community of external counsel, in-house counsel, and other experts in the ADR field are using these mechanisms to manage conflict to enable purpose. As part of this goal, I am hosting the CPR Y-ADR Corporate Counsel Interview Series, where I'm speaking to corporate counsel and ombuds in many different countries around the world in different companies and contexts about their experience with ADR, as well as their career advice for young practitioners in the ADR field. Today, I am delighted to welcome Ashley J. Davis, who is Associate Ombuds at the University of Washington in Seattle, Washington. Hi, Ashley, we're so delighted to have you here today.
Hi, Elizabeth. Thanks for having me.
My first question for you is, can you tell us a little bit about your career experience and how you came into your role as Associate Ombuds?
Yeah, sure. So for me, my experience with dispute resolution started in law school. So I went to the University of Wisconsin in Madison, Wisconsin for law school, and there they had a mediation clinic. So during my 3L year, I was able to learn more about the field, do a 40-hour training, and that really sparked the interest in me from there. And then post law school, I started looking for positions where I could continue that work. So I was allowed, and I'm just thankful to have the opportunity to work in the city of Chicago for a mediation center called the Center for Conflict Resolution. I was there for several years doing all types of different dispute resolution work in different contexts. So I was able to gain a lot of great experience there in that context, setting up mediations, doing the logistics and administrative work, doing mediator support as folks were navigating different cases that came to the office, and then also mediating myself. So I tallied over 100 mediations while working there. And then at a point I wanted to pivot. And so I really found a lot of interest in working with students, working with higher education institutions. So I looked for opportunities there, and I was lucky enough to get into doing investigations for student conduct and student misconduct at Arizona State University. So that gave me a good landscape and background and foundation in the higher ed field. And after about a year or so, I really wanted to pivot back into formal dispute resolution work and really get back into kind of my home space. And so I was able to apply and get a position at the University of Washington as an associate ombud. And so here I've been able to just continue that trajectory. And so I've just been really excited about the opportunity to get back to dispute resolution, conflict coaching, mediation work, which is kind of where everything started.
Wow, you've had such an amazing career trajectory. And I just want to focus on a little bit on the home space that you mentioned. Can you tell us a little more about your role as Associate Ombuds at the University of Washington? And for those who aren't familiar, how is the Ombud service within the university structured? Who are the clients that you serve? And what are the types of ADR services that you provide?
Yeah. So I'm what's considered an organizational ombud. So what that means is that we serve the entire institutional organization that we've been hired to. So for higher education, typically that's an internal service. So it would be provided to usually certain constituents, sometimes just faculty, sometimes just students. But our office here, we serve all three constituencies at the university. So faculty, staff, and students. on all of the campuses that cover the University of Washington. So there's a campus in Tacoma and a campus in Bothell. So we serve them and the medical centers as well. So there are doctors, clinicians that we serve, and alumni as well, and parents. The only folks we don't serve currently would be patients. So folks that might have some concerns or questions as they're navigating the hospital system. Those are the only folks we don't serve. But generally, in terms of the kinds of services we get approached about, it's typically, I would say 75 to 80% mainly conflict coaching. So individualized services where we're talking with faculty, staff, and students predominantly about whatever kind of concerns or issues that come up for them as they're navigating the university space. And so trying to come up with a action plan based on their goals. So whatever they're whatever they're trying to accomplish, that's where we would be focusing or trying to come up with a plan, come up with options, come up with ideas and option generation to give them thoughts and ways to navigate and figure out best options that work for them. And so once we cover all of that, then they have the autonomy to choose to do or not do whatever it is that we've talked about. So that's typically, I would say, the bulk of our services. We also do mediation and other group facilitation services as well when we're requested. And so that takes up the rest of our work, I would say.
You mentioned that your constituents are faculty, staff, and students. So how do your constituents find out about the services that the Ombuds function offers?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. So that's something that Ombuds all around, I think, are always trying to think about is how to market our services, how to reach out to folks. And so for us, we typically are going to different faculty meetings, staff meetings, and trying to make our presence known and just get in front of different departments as we're able to just tell them, even if it's just 5 or 10 minutes, about our services. For me, I'm predominantly the student facing Ombud. So I'm working mainly with students navigating their concerns, so trying to meet them where they're at. So doing different student events. So right now during the summertime, summer months, there's been a lot of orientation events that I've been trying to attend to make sure that the Ombud services, folks are aware of Ombud services. So things like that, just trying to go to either orientations, sometimes going to staff meetings, sometimes going to just different department opportunities where they're doing like lunch and learns or things like that, where folks have the opportunity to come from the outside to share a resource that's available to them at the university. So we try to do that. And then we have some marketing materials that we're developing online as well. Just with the pandemic, it's less in person, face-to-face marketing and more trying to figure out how to navigate and market in the online space. So I think that's the next horizon for us.
We've talked previously about how lay complainants or users of the Ombud service might not know about different types of ADR. So what do you do to educate people about different forms of ADR? And what do you do to help people to choose an appropriate form of ADR for their particular conflict or issue?
Absolutely. So one of the things that we're doing in those individualized conversations is talking about obviously their goals and then talking about some potential solutions. So sometimes folks will come in, as they're telling us what's going on and their concerns, they're sharing their story and say they want mediation or they want a restorative justice process. And so oftentimes we'll say that's great, but then we'll also navigate through to their goals and talk about options. And then in that process, discuss what does it actually mean to do mediation? What does it actually look like to do a restorative process? What does it look like for some sort of other facilitation? And as we're talking through, usually either that will, change possibly what they're looking for because they didn't entirely understand what mediation or restorative justice was before we had the conversation. or just may not align with their goals, because sometimes they just want to may want a space to just be the opportunity to be said that they're right, or that the person can hear what I have to say and then they don't have the opportunity to respond, which isn't really a mediation, right? So in those kinds of spaces, once we explain the process, go through it with them in terms of their options to achieve their goals, sometimes it turns out that that wouldn't meet up with their goals or doesn't match up. So then we talk about different action plans or other alternatives that might work better, potentially. And then they are ultimately, it's up to them to kind of voluntarily say, yes, this is the process that I want to move forward with. And then we would set about talking about how we would get the other person, if it is going to be a facilitation or a mediation, involved or agree to participate in that process, because it has to be voluntary in order for us to proceed. So we would need to get that other party involved as well.
You make a really important point about talking to your constituents and really understanding what they want in order to help them, shape the appropriate ADR process.
Absolutely. Yeah.
You also mentioned earlier, the changes that have been brought about by the pandemic in terms of how you interact with the constituents. And of course, during the pandemic period, I understand that a lot of your work has moved online. Could you tell us about your experience with virtual forms of ADR, for example, mediation?
Yeah, great question. I think that every dispute practitioner has been trying to navigate this online space in a new way, especially with the pandemic going on. And so it's been, a lot of folks have experienced good things as well as things they don't like so much about the space. I'll say for myself, I found it just another interesting tool and opportunity to offer access to folks. So in terms of our mediation services, it's not a huge portion of our work, but of the folks who have participated, we have been able to do great work with them together. So usually that preparation work that I talked about previously, about making sure everybody's goals are aligned in advance, talking through kind of the preparation process as to what does a mediation actually look like. We do that for each side and for every participant. And so then when they come into the space together, they've already been prepared as to kind of what to expect, how things are going to proceed for the day. And usually it's just 3 or 4 squares on a screen. So it's not as riveting as seeing folks in person and seeing their live reactions with their hands maybe. But we are able to get a lot out of facial expressions and just through conversation that are still tense or difficult. It still comes out, whatever their concerns are. And we try to create a space that allows that conversation to move forward and ask good questions so that we're able to kind of move or transition to a space where the information comes out and then we're able to find some options that might work for everybody in the space. So for me, I found it just a new terrain to practice my skills and do the work that I think we've all been trained to do. So for me, it's been more exciting, another way to make sure that we're offering services and offering our skills to the communities that we serve. And so hopefully, I believe it sounds like it'll continue just because the pandemic isn't ending anytime soon, it seems like, unfortunately. Which means I think even if we were to go in person, flip a switch, there was no more COVID tomorrow, we likely still be engaged in some sort of online work, I think, and just incorporating it as an option for folks who may not want to try to show up in person at our offices. So I think sharpening that toolbox and just experiencing it with clients as they're navigating Zoom has been a real interesting space, but something new and different.
I'm really happy to hear that the online space can be used effectively to offer essentially another mechanism to access justice and dispute resolution. And you mentioned already a little bit about, what we might expect as we hopefully move out of the pandemic. And I was wondering if you could go into a little more detail about, what aspects of ADR and the Ombuds services do you think will remain or should remain as we move more into an in-person world? Are there any aspects of ADR that you think really essentially need to be in person?
Yeah, I think so. It's an interesting question. So I would say I think some services probably, in general, most of them rely on that in-person kind of dynamic or some level of communication in person. But and I think in theory that should be the bedrock, of how some of these services are done and how you're trained to do them. And I've been through a lot of training, so that's definitely a key element. But I would definitely say that as we're navigating moving forward, mainly because I don't necessarily know that we'll ever be completely done with navigating certain issues that have come from the pandemic. And even just navigating folks who are scared to come back, right? Even if say there is no pandemic, some folks are just not going to feel comfortable being in person fully, even if the space is made ready for them. So really, I think it's less about kind of should as much as like what works for the kind of practice that you have. I think some folks, as people tell me in different conferences that I was going to, some folks were always doing their dispute resolution services online. There was always kind of a smaller group, much smaller group of folks who are always doing online dispute resolution or mediation services. That's just grown, exponentially, of course, during the pandemic. And so I definitely think it's nice to have the opportunity to see people in person. It's nice to be able to see that body language. It's nice to be able to have that camaraderie in person of, seeing them get water or drink coffee and, or just having the opportunity to sit together during a hard conversation and sit with that tension sometimes. But I definitely still think that just when it comes to access, when it comes to just realities of people's comfort or discomfort, and then just with what opportunities are created by utilizing this online space, that I don't think you can discount how important and balancing that in person and online space, I think will be essential for successful practitioners. So going forward, I think offering in person to people, and that's kind of what we're thinking as an office, offering the in person, but based on what we've seen, a lot of persons have said, actually, I would rather just do it online, and giving them that choice. And so I don't think there's anything that can't be done virtually. I think there are some preferences from mediators and things like that that drive kind of what works for them and their practice. But I definitely think kind of that balance of online and in person is going to still stick with us for some time. And so I don't think there's anything that is kind of off the table there. And I think we kind of have to be flexible as a field in that space.
Absolutely. And I think it's so important and empowering for constituents to have the choice whether they want their issue resolved online or offline, depending on where they feel safest.
Yeah.
I know that some of your ADR work has involved not just individuals, but also groups and collectives. Are there any special ADR techniques or mechanisms that you think are particularly useful for this group context?
Yeah, I definitely think for groups, as I said, we'll get occasionally departments or larger groups kind of reach out and say that they're interested in some sort of facilitative process. So typically, one of the things I think is really important is kind of getting a sense from that group as to what the concerns are, because not everybody, even though folks think they're on the same page with what the problem is, that's not always the case. So even just coming in and doing that preparatory work, I think is kind of one of the most key pieces with larger groups, kind of who's going to be there, what is their role in the space, do they need to be there, because sometimes the groups can swell to these larger numbers or larger sizes, it's not always clear that everybody needs to be in the room, and it's just maybe that they wanted to just bring more folks along, the more the merrier. So really trying to do what I've noticed that's been really extremely helpful is that pre or in advance administrative work and preparation to bring folks together, to make sure that you have the right people, that you have a good sense as the mediator as to what the concerns of the group are, and then doing your prep work as to what kind of questions and what kind of process are you going to use. And so in terms of processes, I think depending on the group's concerns and depending on the group's desires, that will shift in terms of what process. And obviously your experience as a mediator, if you're comfortable with restorative justice, are you comfortable doing a circle? Are you comfortable doing a community accountability process, or, you know, something of the like, or just, you know, a different kind of facilitation. So having those different kind of tools in your toolkit to offer and to kind of play with to see what will work best for the group that you're trying to offer the service to. And then I would say in terms of in the room services, definitely just being attentive to kind of where the group is going, because obviously, so I'm trained in a facilitative model and a frame for ADR. So typically I'm going where the group is going. But if you're keeping track as the mediator as to what are the things that need to be covered, what are the things you haven't gotten to, keeping track of time, because larger groups can, you know, can tend to go into different directions. And so it's hard to kind of rein them in sometimes. So definitely keeping track to make sure that you cover everything that they said initially that they wanted to cover. And then as you're wrapping things up, trying to have things as firm or as detailed as possible. So I prefer to do either having someone in the group write out whatever the outcomes were, or myself, I'll write out whatever the outcomes or agreements were in an informal way, just so that folks are all on the same page and have repeated and know collectively, this is what we're agreeing to. This is the timeline we've agreed to do it in. This is what, you know, the outcome or the final agreement or arrangement that we've decided upon as a collective. If they're coming back in, you know, X amount of time, you know, what does that look like for them to come back? If they have additional questions or concerns, you know, really kind of setting out with some specificity at the end, what the group has agreed upon and what the final decisions were, so that everybody's on the same page there. Because I will say, obviously, people hear different things in different rooms. So you want to make sure everybody's kind of clear and on the same page. So I would definitely say those would be the key pieces for me. So that prep work, and then especially the final piece around that specificity, making sure everybody's on the same page with where the final agreement or arrangement was, and doesn't have any additional questions or concerns.
I think your emphasis on preparation and that group context is especially important to make sure that, you know, there is a spokesperson or someone or some people who properly can speak on behalf of the group, and that the scope of the issues that will be, you know, mediated or resolved are actually defined with I wanted to focus on your last comment about outcomes and ADR proceedings. And I was wondering, how often do you have a binding decision in the outcome of the ADR processes that you're part of? Or if not, you know, what do you do to ensure or encourage voluntary compliance with an agreed outcome?
Yeah, so as I stated before, so I'm trained in a more facilitative model generally. So typically that just means that the group, I'm facilitating the group as opposed to telling the group what to do or what they have to do kind of at the end. I'll also state that in terms of Ombuds work for organizations, typically it is more facilitative in that the group or the folks who are coming, they're usually kind of telling you kind of where they're seeing things go or what they'd like to see happen kind of at the end as their goal or as their ultimate kind of outcome there. So those are the kind of two parameters, along with confidentiality, that are working kind of constantly within the space, at least generally for Ombuds, and then also for me specifically. So with that in mind, I'll say most of these are not binding agreements that folks are coming up with. These are not, agreements that, someone could take and then go and go to a judge and say, oh my gosh, they didn't pay me $50 on Wednesday like they said they would by check. And so I would like my $50 back, in court. So, and I think that's kind of one of the key differences with when navigating organizations. It's not as concrete as that. Oftentimes you're dealing with relationships, right, within departments and between folks, maybe role clarity as to what folks' jobs are supposed to be, what they think it is, maybe work environments in terms of something that has been broken, as opposed in terms of the workspace navigating together. And so oftentimes, because it's more relational, and there's not these hard and fast things that they're trying to do, like money, in terms of like an agreed upon thing, like you owe me $1,000, then it is going to be a much, I guess, not softer agreement, but something that's more about relational changes, or more about role clarity and identification, more about maybe they're agreeing to training or something like that. Those are the typical kinds of things that you might see. Maybe more communication via email versus, via Teams or something like that, Microsoft Teams. So it just kind of depends on the type of group that you're working with, and the type of group, their concerns, the types of concerns they're bringing to you. Sometimes we will get referrals that are maybe concerned about the fact that there is or is not an agreement. So what we will typically share is like, we can communicate with the group that at the end, since we were referred by, say, HR, for example, if you would like to share with HR that you all reached an agreement or that you didn't, that's up to you all to do. If we were to ever sort of share or communicate ultimately with HR, we would be getting that agreement or understanding from the group in advance before we did any additional communications. So we would get that understanding kind of from the group writ large. And then typically, even if we did get that agreement from the group to follow up with HR or whoever the referral source was, then that referral source would only typically get the outcome. They would not get details as to what the conversation was, or what, all of the myriad specificities or whatever that came out during that conversation. That would be on the HR person to follow up with the individuals, or on the individuals to follow up with the HR person or whoever else sent it, if it was a department head, whoever, to follow up to have that more detailed conversation. So for us, it would be more so, did it go well? Did they get an agreement or not? And then that's kind of it, because we want to just make sure we're protecting confidentiality and ensuring that we empower clients to do some of that work as well, right? Like, so we're not trying to be the mouthpiece for other individuals in that capacity. We do our trend reporting at the end of the year through our annual reports, but in terms of individual cases, we try to be as explicit as possible with folks in terms of what's possible for us to communicate, what we will and won't, and then make sure that we get involvement from clients to either share what they like to share or not, so that everybody has the privacy, or has the level of confidentiality they like to see from their cases. So that's kind of what we value, and how we navigate that piece.
I'd like
Was
to
that helpful?
Yeah, absolutely, incredibly helpful. And I before doing this interview series, I didn't actually know very much about Ombuds services. So all the insights you've shared are novel to me, and I'm sure actually also novel to a lot of the young practitioners in our audience. And so I'd now like to pivot to some questions about those who might want to pursue a career in the Ombuds. And my first question is, as a matter of context, how many universities in the US have Ombuds services like the one there is at the University of Washington?
Yeah, I would say I would say maybe a quarter, maybe a third have some sort of ombud service. So I'll say it kind of ranges. So as I stated initially, some of them are just serving one constituency group. So oftentimes it might just be faculty. It may just be that folks are serving students. So it just kind of depends. And then in some cases, or in a lot of cases, I'll say if they are serving faculty or within organizations, generally this can happen where somebody who's been working there for a long time or who's done well in a different role will get elevated or moved into an ombud position. So it's not kind of opened up for other folks to necessarily apply for the job as much as someone who's trusted and has a good reputation at the institution will get moved into an ombuds position serving typically that space. So if it's a faculty member who's really trusted, they may get moved into a faculty ombuds role. Or if it's a staff person who's been there doing great work, they may move them into that kind of staff ombuds position. But yeah, so I would say generally they serve different constituencies, but generally about, I would say, a third to a quarter. So it's not as common at all universities as you would like to see, but it's definitely a growing field, I would say. In terms of the US, I would say the largest amount of ombuds are probably within the higher ed or government sectors.
That's so interesting. I was wondering, what's your advice for young practitioners who want to enter an ombud service, whether that's in an institution and government or in some other context? You mentioned already before a bit about one pathway to becoming an ombud, but I was wondering if you had some general career advice.
Yeah, definitely. I would say in terms of the pathway, I will say it's opaque. So there's no kind of clear, like one omnidirectional way to do an ombud or get into an ombud's career. So if you talk to different ombuds, they'll tell you all kinds of different ways that they've navigated or made it into the field. So generally speaking, though, I would say definitely getting some sort of formalized training in dispute resolution, I would say would be one of the kind of best and kind of, just foundational ways to navigate into the field. So whether that's a law degree, you don't have to get a law degree though to do ombuds work. So I don't want to put that out. You could just get, could get a master's degree in conflict resolution, or just start by getting a 40-hour training and then doing consistent work within the dispute resolution field, like regular mediations or regular facilitations in some sort of process where you're consistently engaged in some sort of alternative dispute resolution. And that's more so just so you get that experience. I would say also there is an ombuds training offered by the International Ombuds Association. So that's an association that is for ombuds to get kind of, conferences, development, et cetera, through this organization. And so you can do an 40-hour ombuds training through them. They are doing virtual and online trainings as well now. So you could do that training, and that would add or boost kind of to your resume, some of the skills and show that consistent interest in the field of ombuds work. And I would say there are some other intersecting things that are helpful as well. So organizational development. So sometimes HR or those kinds of fields intersect because you do have to know organizations, right? If you're going to be an organizational ombud, understanding how they work. So some of that business side of things. So organization theory, those kinds of things might be helpful as well, or MBA potentially, and then or HR experience, and then kind of pivoting or using all of those skills collectively to transition into a formal ombuds position. And just really keeping your eye out there. There's also an ombuds blog that posts jobs all the time. So whenever they arise or pop up, which there's some, X amount a month, 5 or 10 a month that might come out. And they're not just in the US, they're also international. Definitely just kind of looking through those and getting a sense of kind of what the typical requirements and things are would be a good way to start to get your wheels turning and get your eyes set on some ways to kind of position yourself well. I will say the field does lean older, but if you do get that experience early enough on in your career where you have consistent service, that's why I'm saying like getting as much experience as you can early will allow you to, explain and articulate kind of your bona fides in an interview or in a cover letter as you're applying to different posts and positions when they come up.
It sounds like there are numerous pathways into an Ombuds service, and it's so useful to know all of the different sources that you can go to for guidance and information, like the blog that you mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
My final question for you is, what is your advice for young practitioners in the ADR field?
Yeah. So I will say that I just think I've just been really blessed to be able to participate in the field as a younger practitioner and have the opportunity to, work as early as I did in the field, which I know is not necessarily common. But I would say to other young practitioners, kind of similar to what I was stating before, just getting your foot in the door, getting in that experience, even if it is volunteer. Hopefully you can get paid or get a stipend for some of the work that you're doing. But definitely, staying in the space of continual learning and training, because oftentimes I think, just having an expansive toolbox is what's really useful as you're a practitioner navigating whichever pathway or career that you would like to go into. So being familiar with all the different iterations or permutations of what dispute resolution can look like. So being familiar with what does negotiations look like? What does mediation look like? What is restorative justice? What does ombuds work look like? Like having familiarity there, getting training as you're able in those different spaces. Or just building on the 40 hours that you have and continuing to, stay connected to the community or a community if you can find one. I think is really essential so that you're able to, understand the field, understand kind of what's going on, what are the trends. Hopefully, if it's possible, going to conferences so that you're able to see and get a range of kind of what are the hot topics in the field and just kind of what are people looking for or talking about as other practitioners. And then that'll also build your network up so that you're able to kind of, be aware of positions and roles as they arise, because they are so discrete and they can come up and show up at different ways and in different spaces that you may or may not have been expecting. And so having that tap in to the field, whether it's through a conference, whether it's through a local mediation or dispute resolution community, or whether it's just through constant awareness by tapping in online, whether it's through a blog or other kind of spaces, I think will kind of allow you to keep your skills fresh, but also allow you to have an awareness of the different pathways available within the field, because it all relates. It's just what will show up in a position, maybe some weird combination of a bunch of different things. And so if you have those tools in your toolbox, you'll be able to show up possibly better than some other applicants. And so I would say definitely keeping those things on your radar would be my best bets and recommendations, keeping that toolbox fresh and staying aware and connected to the field as possible.
I've learned so much through this conversation about the full spectrum of dispute resolution tools, negotiation, mediation, and restorative justice. I will certainly try to keep my toolbox, my ADR toolbox, fresh. Thank you so much, Ashley, for your time and for your insights. And I want to thank our audience as well for tuning in.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciated this opportunity and this time. And thanks again to you and to CPR for even inviting me for the conversation. I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you, Ashley.
Thanks. Have a good day.